This is Jose Merino, Editor-in-Chief of the Neurology family of journals. The Neurology podcast provides practical information to neurologists and other clinicians to help them provide better care for their patients. Thanks for listening and have a great week.
Hi, this is Stacey Clardy from the Salt Lake City VA and the University of Utah. Today on the Neurology podcast, we're again joined by Elizabeth Bick and Matthew Schrag for part 2 of our 3-part series on research misconduct. Elizabeth and Matthew are both part of a very active small group of individuals who are working behind the scenes to maintain scientific integrity by reviewing the published scientific literature for anomalies or evidence of misconduct. In part 1 of the series, we talked a lot about what is the motivation for doing this work, especially when it does not make you popular with many friends and colleagues. And for this part, we will focus more on some of the details of how this actually gets done. Let's dive right in. So when you find a concern, what's the process? Is it emailing authors? Is it posting it up on PubPeer? Is it going to the institution or the journal? What's the process?
Yeah, it's actually, for me, very much on a case-by-case basis. And I have to say that the vast majority, it is handled privately. But part of it depends on the scale and also where the existing relationships lie. I think that when possible, I'd like to try to help colleagues who have these sorts of problems to navigate them ethically and responsibly. And I think that there's lots of people in the industry who are looking for that. But there are times where it's on a different scale. There's a time when these sorts of problems reach a scale that is borderline and sometimes overtly criminal. There's things we often handle differently. We often try to do a more thorough investigation, look at every paper that somebody has published and really try to understand the patterns, and have found a considerable amount of benefit from working with investigative journalists to help tell that story completely and responsibly. And I think as we're starting to talk about cultural change within a field, which is what the area of Alzheimer's disease and neurodegeneration really needs, I think that telling those stories completely in a deeply investigated way helps with some of the skepticism you encounter. It's very easy for people to dismiss these sorts of problems as isolated, to dismiss them as a single bad apple or science that is unimportant. And that's why looking at things in a very cautious, careful, but also holistic way helps us to bring the story that this is really a problem for this field. And so I think for me, how to react to this depends on the scale of the problem and the individuals who are involved. Oftentimes, I simply email the problem to authors and we talk about it. I do use PubPeer. It's a server where you can post concerns anonymously or with your name attached to it and have a public conversation about those things. And I do see a place for that. Certainly not everything that I work on goes that way. But part of it also depends on how you encountered the problem. I think sometimes journals bring issues to you and are looking for advice, or colleagues come to you and are looking for advice. And I try to respect the confidentiality of those processes, especially when those processes are working, which occasionally they do work. There are absolutely journals and institutions who are looking to do the right things in these cases. Unfortunately, I think more journals and more institutions are not. They're looking to protect their reputation or to cover problems up, and that unfortunately is the norm. And I think that's why these alternative avenues for dealing with these problems, like working with investigative journalists in the media, like PubPeer, where you can have a public conversation about these things, are so important. This is a critical check on the existing structures for dealing with research integrity, which are frankly quite anemic.
And what do you say to, I'm sure, the criticism that's been leveraged that you're contributing to a hit piece on an individual? I'm sure you've heard that. What is your response to that?
Yeah, I've only ever partnered with journalists that I had a lot of confidence in, to be fair. Frankly, as we discussed earlier, you don't know when these kinds of problems are going to affect you. You can certainly have collaborations and things where these problems could come home to you and you would want to be treated fairly. So I think everybody deserves to have their side of the story told, and the process absolutely has to be fair. But that's not what these stories that we've been working on are. These are not hit pieces. These are very serious lapses in research integrity.
Elizabeth, do you have any thoughts?
For me, it's important that other people know there's a potential problem with a paper. When I started to do this work in 2014. Then I just wrote to the journals, and I had expected, and rather naively, may I add, that if I would write with a problem to the journal, that a couple of weeks later, the paper would be corrected or retracted. So that was very naive because that is not what happened. I reported around that time around 800 papers. And those 800 papers most of them were not corrected or retracted, even if I waited about 5 years. So after 5 years, only 1/3 of those papers had been addressed. So that was frustrating because all that time, these papers had a problem, and I wanted to warn other researchers there's a potential problem with figure 3A, and don't base your new line of research on that particular figure.
And government funding or private funding, yeah.
Exactly. And so I started to post these things on Papier, and that is my main route now. Whenever I find a paper, I will post it there. Not to smear anyone, but to warn other people. And some of these problems could be honest error. So I try to word this very objectively. Figure 2A looks remarkably similar to figure 3B. Could the authors please check? And sometimes authors will reply and say, oh, sorry, yeah, we made an error. But I like to keep this in the public eye. So I will usually not address my concerns with authors. I don't know any of these people, and I usually these emails then get pretty nasty. So yeah, that is a route I try to avoid. So I post on Papier. I try to work to write to the institutions and the journals as well. If you work with these huge sets, it's actually very hard to find the email addresses of journals or of the editors or just a way to contact them. And very often I get dismissed with my concerns. So I get angry emails back from the editors, and it's not very productive, I find, in general. So I'm a bit frustrated with that route, and I just post on Papier. And like Matthew, I occasionally will work together with journalists where I feel that a particular case is so important, received so much federal funding, that I feel this is a much bigger story than just one figure here and there, where I really feel that it had to have been cheating and the world needs to know about it. So then I would work with a journalist and stop. I won't post on Papier until the story came out, and then I will post these things.
And where in there, you have a huge following on Twitter or X, whatever we call it these days. Where in there do you fit in your social media presence? Do you ever use that to motivate institutions or journals if you're hitting a wall? What is the role of your social media?
Yeah, sometimes I am using it out of frustration that a paper has a clear problem, and I reported this years ago and nothing has happened. Occasionally, I will call out, not authors, I don't do that usually, but I will call out the journal, like, why didn't you retract this paper? This is a 5-second retraction. But I mainly use my social media, my Twitter, for making people aware of these problems. So I play a sort of a challenge or a game, if you will, called image forensics. I will post a figure from a scientific paper. I will usually not say which paper it is from, but I'll just challenge my audience if they can find the duplication. And the first 3 people with the correct answer will win an emoji award. So I will give them, and they're very happy with it. But of course, my secret purpose is to make people aware of this, because a lot of my followers are scientists. They might peer review papers. They might read these papers, and just triggering this little capacity to find these duplications just when they read a paper, hopefully that will help people find these things before they get published, which is, of course, our goal. Like, we don't want these things to be published. These problems should not have been published. They should have been caught during peer review, during the editorial process. And so I hope with my social media to play a little role in that in a fun way.
That's exactly right, because so often the biggest block to picking up problems is simply asking the question, is this trustworthy? We take that for granted when we approach papers. And if you just start with the question of, could there be manipulation here? Often any competent scientist can see these changes. But starting from that point where we say we know this is possible, that we know that this is out there in the scientific literature, is a key step to making people less vulnerable to it.
Spot on, because that's how I found both of you a while ago. So it's working. And it leads me to another question. When you're reading a manuscript, an abstract, anything in the scientific literature, What are the basics of knowing a paper might contain fraudulent data?
I think there are at least three things that are the triggers. One is when you're looking at images, like when you go through a magazine stand at the grocery store, and sometimes you see things that where the images just don't look right. And often it's that feeling where you're saying something about that looks touched up, right? And so I think just an awareness that when you're looking at photographic evidence in a manuscript, a lot of the representative data that gets published as the result of a photograph. If you see things that look like retouching, that's often a trigger to look a little bit more carefully from a forensic standpoint. But the other two things are a little bit more scientific. One is that sometimes you'll get a gut reaction to a set of data that it's just too perfect. And I don't think we should ignore that. We should normalize that reaction when you're looking at a data set and saying, how come there's no outliers in this data set? Or how come the pictures are so perfect? That's not typical biologically, right? Biology is much messier than that. And so it should be perfectly normal when you're supervising people, when you're working with collaborators, when data comes back too fast, too perfect, faster than you think your team could produce it, to pause long enough and just allow yourself to ask that question of, is this too perfect and how did it get this way? The third piece is I think that research integrity lapses are very asymmetric. We don't see them evenly distributed across literature. In my experience, cheaters cheat. And so when you encounter an individual or a laboratory where the data appears to be unreliable, often you find large clusters of unreliable data in that setting. And so I think one of the things I tell people is you have to absolutely pay attention to that first red flag. The number of times that somebody has a single paper retracted or has a single problem without a doubt, without problems in the rest of their work, is very low.
I agree with Matthew. When I started doing this work, I just looked at papers. I just opened a journal, looked at, 200 of their papers that looked like they were in the molecular biology field, that had lots of photos. And I would just scan all of these papers and learning where the problems were and building up this experience. But then I started looking at papers that had problems. And exactly like Matthew said, if you find a problem in one paper and you search for other papers by those same authors, so not following a journal trail, but following an author trail, you would find more papers than expected to have those problems too. Call them the frequent flyers, like people who fraud once will probably fraud again. And paper after paper with these problems from those particular labs. Nowadays, I mainly work off of tips. So people might work in a lab and say, my professor is just cheating and he or she wants me to bring them certain results, or I know that they're not working honestly, that they're faking results, etc. And so then I will look at papers from that particular lab, see if I can find any visible problems, because you can cheat in many ways that would not leave problems, but occasionally I will find problems. Or I might just see other people talking about a lab and saying, oh, I've never been able to reproduce those results from that particular paper. And it's highly cited, but nobody else could replicate those results. So I might give that paper a particular critical look. And so I just receive lots of tips every day, more than I can possibly follow. And each of these tips could lead to months of work if it is a very productive lab with lots of problems. And so that could take weeks or months of my life scanning thousands of papers from one particular lab and then posting immediately on Papier.
Arguably, the folks who might be able to best detect a poor research practice are the vulnerable people in the lab, the graduate students, the technicians who are actually at the bench doing the techniques, watching the person next to them do the technique, right? And not to absolve the principal investigator, but they're often pulled away. They're writing grants, they're teaching, they're traveling, speaking. So as a follow-up to what you're telling me, which is you are getting tips, I guess my question to you is, how do people get you tips? What is the best way to alert you, especially these vulnerable folks for whom anonymity is important?
Most people will contact me through Twitter. I think people create an account and then try to, can I direct message you? And then I'll open my DM for them. Emails. I often retweet other people who do similar work. Some of them work anonymously, some under their full names. There's a bunch of us who do this. But I just encourage people, if you work in such a lab, It's really hard to give good advice. Very often I cannot see the problems from looking at the papers. There's so much hierarchy in academia and you're so dependent on your advisor and you want to get out of the lab with a beautiful paper or two. I think the situation where a graduate student starts photoshopping by themselves is very rare. I think the more common situation is that of a bullying or very demanding professor who pushes his or her graduate students and postdocs and staff to Photoshop or to fake in any other way just to produce particular results that fit their hypothesis. So I think that is a very common situation. And I tell people to get out of that if they can. Try not to Photoshop if somebody asks you that. But it's really tough if you're a very early career researcher to get out of those labs.
Wow, yeah. That, as you said and alluded to before, this is at the end of the day about people, and we hopefully give people the tools to do the right thing and not concede to other motivations.
The way we're going to solve this problem is with a cultural change, right? And I think that we really need to look at the next generation of scientists. And we now have these requirements for trainees at every level of training to receive instruction in what's called the responsible conduct of research. And for so much of that, to be frank, it's sort of checking a box. And it's not totally a waste of time. It's certainly important things that are taught in those courses. But I think that the way we teach responsible conduct of research needs to become much, much more robust. That this is something where you need formal education in what the standards are in your domain so that you don't have one very powerful professor normalizing certain types of behavior, but that people who are new to the field and relatively naive in what the standards are hearing from multiple people what the community standards are, and those standards need to be discussed very explicitly about how you handle your data, about how you log your data, and about what you do if somebody asks you to change your data. But we need to create an environment where the integrity of the data is absolutely sacrosanct, and that we diminish the value of some stunning new finding in favor of elevating the value of reproducible discovery. And so I think that we have this notion now of people with magic hands who can get results that other people can't get. And I don't think that's a good thing. We really want to elevate the value of reproducible discovery. And so when you have a big result, every person in the lab who attempts that result should be able to get it. I think that really emphasizing culturally how we address this problem from an educational standpoint is how we're going to turn the corner on. There's something fundamentally human about cheating. Right? I don't think you're going to make that go away. I don't think there's anything about the human race that has ever been immune to cheating, and I don't think scientists are somehow different. But you can create systems that recognize that are not naive to that problem, and that create an environment where you de-incentivize cheating.
Well said, yeah. And it brings to mind the concept that's been said by many, I think, wise and humble folks, right? Like if you think you've discovered something novel, go back and look again, right? And about elevating the idea that what you're doing is either reproducing successfully or extending or expanding and getting away from, as you point out, this obsession with novelty and being the one.
Do you know how often students have come to my office so upset because some other labs, quote unquote, scooped them, that they lost a piece of data that they had discovered? And I always try to have them leaving the office excited by that evidence that what they had found was reproducible, right? We should celebrate that. When some other lab came up with the same discovery, it means you're on the right track.
It's great, and it is all about framing. Related to what we're talking about and what happens after the investigation, can you tell us a little bit about the website Retraction Watch so that perhaps people who aren't aware can go look it up and investigate?
Retraction Watch is a website where a team of journalists and science writers talk about retractions. So once a paper gets retracted, that is the point where they become interested and they will write about it. I don't see Retraction Watch having a direct role in addressing big questions about scientific integrity. They're more at the end of the process where a paper gets retracted. But what they do offer is they offer a glimpse behind the scenes, what led people to either retract their own paper or a journal to retract their paper. what are the stories behind these retractions? That is a very important role. I think a lot of people, myself included, had no idea about what is a retraction and what leads up to that point. So they bring these stories together where it's not just one retraction. It's actually because they have a retraction watch leaderboard. You can see in the leaderboard which scientists have the most retractions, and some of them have dozens or hundreds of retractions. And that shows you there's a problem in that lab. It's not just one retraction. So they compile all that data. They do an enormous amount of effort trying to get everybody behind the scenes talk about these retractions. But very often they don't deal with just a duplicated image. They're not going to look at that because that is like Matthew and myself do. We try to raise the alert with the editors. But once a paper gets retracted, then they will write about it. And it's a very good blog. Recommended to everyone to read it. It gives a unique glimpse behind the scenes.
This has been an incredibly informative part 2 of our 3-part series on research integrity and research misconduct. Thank you for your time. Please continue. This is Stacey Clardy, your podcast editor. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please take a few moments to subscribe, rate, and review the Neurology podcast through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And remember, you can always head to neurology.org/podcast for our full list of past episodes. Or you can also search by keyword in your podcast app for any neurology-specific topics you want to learn about.